On a cool fall morning in October of 2000, 27-year-old Maureen Ryan was out for her daily jog. The air felt crisp in her lungs as she kept a brisk pace along the waters of Cape Cod in Massachusetts. Until recently, she had been working as a rock climbing instructor out west, so as a result, Maureen was in great shape and very fit. She had always been athletic though, rowing crew and playing lacrosse and field hockey back during her high school days in Pittsburgh. But today, halfway through her very routine run, she suddenly felt woozy, and a surge of nausea crept up from her stomach. Maureen slowed to a walk and tried some rhythmic breathing to try to steady her heart rate. Unfortunately, it didn't help. She got dizzier and more lightheaded until it felt like the ground was tilting, and then suddenly it was rushing up at her. The next time she opened her eyes, Maureen was face down on the jogging path, her cheek pressed flat against the cold concrete. Her head absolutely throbbed. She rolled onto her side and began rubbing the bruise on her skull. Maureen felt lucky she hadn't knocked any teeth out when she fell, but at the same time, Maureen just could not understand how her body had just abruptly shut down like that. She had only fainted one other time in her life, and it was back in college after she had gone on an unusually fast treadmill run. Maureen assumed it was just a fluke because it never happened again. But now she wasn't so sure, because just the week before, during another run, she had felt at one point sort of hazy and actually stopped to rest, but that was obviously nothing compared to today, where she actually fell to the ground. And if this had happened while she was on stairs or something, she could have been seriously injured. And so suddenly, Maureen was terrified. It was like she couldn't trust her body anymore, despite having spent so many years working so hard to become strong and healthy and fit. It was like it didn't matter. Her body was going to do whatever it was going to do. Maureen picked herself up and carefully made her way home, and when she got there, she called her Aunt Eileen, who was a doctor in Pittsburgh. Eileen was a pathologist who ran lab tests on tissue, fluids, and organs in order to diagnose diseases, especially heart disease. But she was knowledgeable about most health issues, so Maureen really wanted her opinion on what had just happened to her. Eileen thought for a moment after Maureen told her about how she had just fainted during her run. Then Eileen told Maureen that she might be experiencing some type of irregular heartbeat. If left untreated, Maureen's aunt said that an irregular heartbeat could cause that lightheadedness and fainting that Maureen experienced. But realistically, that was the most mild of symptoms. This irregular heartbeat could lead to permanent damage to her heart, her brain, and other organs. It could even cause strokes, heart failure, and even death. And so Eileen urged Maureen to stop doing any serious exercise until she could meet with a doctor. Maureen appreciated her aunt's advice, but it was hard to accept. Being physically active and pushing her body to its limits made her feel energized, joyful, and alive. To stop exercising cold turkey would be a real challenge for her, but at the same time, she didn't want to risk fainting again, so she promised her aunt that she would take a break from running and would see a doctor as soon as possible. A few days later, Maureen lay on an examination table wearing a hospital gown. She flinched at the feeling of cold metal as the cardiologist stuck a series of electrodes to her chest. Even so, she was still glad to be there. She had not gone for a run since she talked to her aunt, and she was eager for this to be over with. Once the electrodes were in place, the doctor made sure the cables running to the EKG machine were untangled and connected properly. These would convert electrical signals from Maureen's heart into waves displayed on the EKG grid. By studying these lines, the cardiologist would be able to identify any irregularities in Maureen's heart's activity. Maureen closed her eyes and listened as the doctor flicked a switch. The machinery hummed into action, and soon Maureen could hear the beeps corresponding to her heartbeat. 5 minutes later, the test was over, and so Maureen opened up her eyes. The cardiologist quickly pulled up the results on a large computer monitor. His face was neutral as he scrolled through the data, occasionally stopping just to jot something down on a pad of paper. Finally, the doctor scooted his chair back, set down his pen, and turned to face Maureen. He told her he knew why she had been fainting. She had a condition called Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome. It's a congenital heart defect that makes the heart beat faster than it should, sometimes causing dizziness and fainting. Maureen was relieved to have a name now for what she'd been experiencing, but she was also shaken at the thought that there was something fundamentally wrong with her heart. The doctor could see how worried Maureen was, and so he told her the good news was that this condition was totally treatable using a procedure called a catheter ablation. It's a surgery where thin, flexible tubes are guided into areas of the heart suspected of causing the irregular heartbeat. Then, once it's in place, the surgeon permanently changes the electrical circuitry of the heart by creating scar tissue in these problem areas. Scar tissue does not conduct electricity, so once that's done, the irregular heartbeat disappears and the heart returns to normal. Maureen thought this procedure sounded really intense and pretty complicated, but she was at least happy to have, the next steps in place. So she thanked the cardiologist and said she would schedule this procedure as soon as possible. Back at home, Maureen called her doctor aunt with the news, and Eileen suggested that Maureen have the catheter ablation done in Pittsburgh where she was, so Eileen could look after her after the procedure was done. Maureen agreed, thanked her aunt, and hung up. Then Maureen went for a long walk along the bay, letting her mind wander. She hoped the sea breeze and the lapping waves might calm her nerves, but she was too distracted. All she could hear was the sound of her heartbeat in every footstep. 2 weeks later, Maureen stood outside a hospital in Pittsburgh with her aunt Eileen. Maureen had barely slept the night before, worrying about this catheter ablation, what could go wrong. But eventually, they went inside the hospital, and they went up to the receptionist desk, and they signed in. Once Maureen's name was called, she hugged her aunt goodbye, and she followed a nurse down the hall to get prepped for the operation. As Maureen settled onto a gurney, the nurse explained that the procedure would take about 3 to 6 hours, but Maureen would be sedated the entire time and wouldn't feel a thing and would just kind of wake up when it was done. Then the nurse had Maureen lie back, and she inserted an IV drip into her forearm. Seconds later, Maureen started to feel the warm and dreamy sensation as the sedatives hit, and soon her eyelids were too heavy to keep open, and she drifted off to sleep. Several hours later, as Maureen drifted back to consciousness, she stared up at the lights on the ceiling. It took her a minute to realize where she was, in a recovery room at the hospital, but once she understood where she was, she noticed her doctor was right there looking down at her. And once the doctor saw she was awake, he told her that the procedure was a total success. He said they had been able to find the section of Maureen's heart that was causing the irregularity, and they covered it with scar tissue. The doctor advised Maureen to schedule occasional follow-up EKG tests just to make sure her heartbeat remained steady, but otherwise, she was good to go. She could go back to her normal life. Maureen could not contain her smile. This was everything she had hoped for, and she could not wait to get back on her feet and go for a run. Two decades later, in October of 2022, Maureen sat on her bed shivering and dripping wet, holding a phone to her ear and wishing her Aunt Eileen was with her again. She had just made it back to her Seattle houseboat after fainting during that run in Lake Union Park. One moment she was jogging along happily, the next she was unconscious on the ground in the pouring rain, staring at a bunch of rabbits. It felt like her past heart issues were coming back to haunt her. But Maureen just couldn't understand how that would have happened. The catheter ablation operation she did back in 2000 was supposed to have fixed everything. And she had been exercising and living her life normally for years now without any major problems. But now here she was again, 2 decades later, nauseous and dizzy and passing out on the ground. After waiting a while on hold, Maureen was finally connected to a doctor who was inside of her healthcare plan. She told him about fainting in the park and summarized her fairly extensive medical history. The doctor told her to come in the next day for an EKG and also some blood tests. After she hung up, Maureen just sat there staring at the rain landing on the water. She thought she was done dealing with her body's mysteries, but clearly something else was wrong. The next morning, Maureen woke up early, still feeling rattled. She filled a thermos with coffee, put on a raincoat, and headed to her appointment. Once at the hospital, Maureen explained to the cardiologist how her career as a conservation biologist kept her extremely physically active. Even outside of her work, exercise was her favorite activity. In addition to jogging, Maureen skied, she swam, and went mountain biking. Occasionally, she would still experience a bit of dizziness or nausea, but it passed quickly. And every doctor she'd seen in the 22 years since her catheter ablation always told Maureen the same thing. Her vital signs were right where they should be. The cardiologist nodded and took some notes. Then he had Maureen lie back and arranged a series of electrodes on her chest for another EKG. Maureen took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and focused on the soothing hum of the machine as it measured her heartbeat. After a few minutes, the cardiologist pushed back his chair from the computer and came to Maureen's side and helped her sit up. Maureen braced herself for bad news from this test, but the cardiologist only shrugged, shook his head, and told Maureen that her results were normal. Nothing looked out of the ordinary. Maureen felt lost and frustrated. She knew the test had to be wrong because she was positive something wasn't right in her body. Last night in the park, she genuinely thought she was going to die. So how could this EKG test show nothing? It made no sense. The cardiologist told Maureen to call if she experienced the symptoms again, but until then, there really wasn't anything he or the hospital could do. Maureen thanked the doctor and appreciated what he was doing, but she knew now it was up to her to do some research of her own. Back at her houseboat, Maureen sat on the deck with a cup of coffee, a stack of books, and a printed copy of her test results. She had stopped by the library on the way home to check out a few books on heart conditions. Maureen's career as a conservation biologist had trained her to identify patterns in complex data, so studying EKG results did not seem overwhelming to her. The chart showed the electrical energy of her heartbeat on a graph. Each heartbeat looked like a spike as the blood is pushed out, with a little hiccup before and after it. She could see exactly how much electrical energy was being transmitted each time her heart beat, and exactly how long each beat lasted. After looking at these charts for a while, Maureen noticed an irregularity in her heartbeat that the doctor had not mentioned. The amount of time from when her heartbeat spiked to when her heart was ready for the next beat seemed to vary from beat to beat. Sometimes it was very short, and other times it was much longer. This worried Maureen because she knew the heart is supposed to beat very evenly. So she grabbed the phone and called her Aunt Eileen. Her aunt recognized it immediately as a heart condition that can cause fast, unpredictable heartbeats. It's called long QT syndrome, and it's very tricky to diagnose because most patients actually show no symptoms. But for those that do, the most common symptoms are lightheadedness, blurred vision, and fainting, just like Maureen had. Eileen recommended a doctor in Seattle who specialized in heart disorders. If Maureen did have long QT syndrome, he'd be able to confirm it. Maureen thanked her aunt for all her help and said she would call back once she had news. On a cold and gray winter morning the following month, Maureen was back at the hospital in Seattle, this time carrying a bag containing her workout clothes and running shoes. She followed a nurse into the cardiology wing, then into a changing room where she put on her workout clothes. A few minutes later, a man knocked and introduced himself as the doctor that Maureen's aunt had recommended. He led Maureen down the hallway to a larger room with a treadmill right in the middle. The doctor then hooked pulse monitors to Maureen's wrist and forearms, and he explained that he'd be monitoring her heartbeat and blood pressure while she ran on the treadmill. That way, he could determine what was changing inside her body during vigorous exercise. Maureen did some stretching and then began a brisk walk as the doctor slowly accelerated the treadmill. Soon, Maureen was sweating, huffing, and running at full speed. And all the while, the doctor just kept his eyes on his screen. And after running for a little bit, Maureen suddenly felt a very familiar sensation. Her peripheral vision turned foggy, her head felt woozy, and then before she could do anything, she was falling face first onto the rubber mat of the treadmill. When Maureen blinked back to consciousness, she looked up and saw this big group of men and women wearing hospital scrubs crouched down around her. One of them reached down and helped scoop her up into a sitting position. And as they did that, Maureen realized this was an emergency resuscitation team that had been called in when she fainted to resuscitate her. The doctor who had been overseeing the running test came over and crouched down by Maureen's side. He explained that her blood pressure and heart rate had plummeted when she was running, and then she passed out. It happened too fast for anyone to catch her. But the doctor told her that this test had actually been really useful because the results showed her issue wasn't a problem with her heart. It was more likely a complicated fainting condition sometimes seen in athletes. For Maureen, intense exercise was short-circuiting the nerve endings that regulated her heartbeat. This caused her blood pressure to drop, which in turn slowed the flow of blood to her brain. This is what made her feel lightheaded and dizzy to the point of fainting. Maureen, who was still sitting on the treadmill, was dazed by the diagnosis. Every doctor she had seen for the past 20 years had told her there was something wrong with her heart, that was the issue. But now it sounded like the problem was actually in her brain. Maureen asked the doctor, what do I do? How do I keep myself from fainting? The doctor smiled and told Maureen she was actually in luck. To get around the nerve issues and stabilize her blood pressure, all she would need to do was consume 1.5 teaspoons of ordinary table salt every day. Now, that's more salt than most people consume on a daily basis, but it was just enough above the normal amount that it would raise her blood pressure to the point where she would not faint the next time she did strenuous exercise. This sounded almost too easy to Maureen, but at the same time, she was grateful that she had a cure. She got to her feet, thanked everyone, and then went to go buy some salt. But a month later, on a cloudy, rainy Seattle afternoon, Maureen, who was very frustrated, stepped out onto the deck of her houseboat and dumped her salt into the water. She was totally done with this cure. Daily doses of salt had done nothing. For weeks, Maureen had been dissolving salt in a tall glass of warm water and forcing herself to drink it. At first, she held out hope that she might eventually start to see some changes, but she never did. Consuming all this salt had only made her bloated and anxious. It did nothing for her heart. Even on light jogs, Maureen's chest would feel tight, her stomach would turn queasy, and she'd be out of breath like she was about to faint. So whatever was wrong with her heart was definitely still wrong, and the salt was doing nothing to fix it. Frustrated, Maureen again called her Aunt Eileen for advice for what felt like the millionth time. This time, Eileen recommended that Maureen reach out to a very specific physician named Dr. Samir Saba, who specialized in a very special kind of MRI scan that identifies diseases and defects in the heart. Despite the diagnosis Maureen had received, Eileen still thought there really could be issues with her heart. And so this special MRI test, which gives very detailed pictures of the heart, might actually finally answer what was going on with Maureen. Now, Maureen was skeptical that anybody could figure out her mysterious condition after so many other doctors had tried and failed, but she had nowhere else to turn, and so Maureen asked her aunt to go ahead and book her one of these special MRI scans with Dr. Saba, and while she did that, Maureen would buy a flight to Pittsburgh. A week later, Maureen sat nervously in the front passenger seat as her Aunt Eileen drove to the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Maureen watched out the window as a soft drizzle fell across the city, the same damp gray weather she was used to back in Seattle. She looked forward to being back on her cozy houseboat, but before she could go home, she still had this one last test she had to take. Maureen shuddered at the sight of yet another hospital as they got out and began walking towards the building. Once they went inside, Maureen followed a nurse through several sets of double doors into a white-walled, brightly lit MRI room. The nurse helped Maureen get undressed while she explained the procedure. A magnetic resonance image, or MRI, can create 3D images of the organs and tissues inside of a person's body. These detailed images allow doctors to find heart damage without needing to perform surgery on the patient. Maureen climbed up onto the stark white table and laid down flat. She heard a machine whir, then the table, with her on it, slid inside a narrow tube. At first, it felt claustrophobic, but Maureen shut her eyes and just pictured herself going for a run, and it put her at ease. Maureen lay there, listening to the sounds of the imaging machine, and then after about an hour, the noises stopped, and she, on her gurney, was slid back out from the tube. Maureen sat up, feeling strangely relaxed. Dr. Saba was there waiting for her, and he told her it would take a couple of weeks to get the results back, but he would call her as soon as he could. 2 weeks later, Maureen was back on her houseboat in Seattle, Washington, when her phone rang. The caller ID said University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Bracing herself for more frustrations or worse, Maureen answered and heard Dr. Saba's voice on the line. He told her he had some absolutely wild news. The issue with Maureen's heart was something that none of her previous doctors had thought of. Not only that, but it was something Maureen had lived with her entire life. The problem with Maureen's heart had nothing to do with its beat or nerve endings or scar tissue or any of the other things doctors had talked about for all these years. Instead, Maureen's heart was the wrong shape. The major artery carrying the blood from Maureen's heart to her body was literally in the wrong place, and so her unusual anatomy was causing Maureen's blackouts, not all the other rare conditions that doctors had thought previously. Maureen's right coronary artery was squished underneath another large blood vessel so that it was slightly constricted. When Maureen went about her normal activities, there wasn't any issues. But when Maureen exercised, her heart had to beat faster and pump more and more blood to keep up. But since her artery was in the wrong place and compressed, eventually it couldn't hold enough blood to meet the needs of the heart. This caused Maureen to faint. And no doctor would ever think to suspect this as the cause, because less than 1% of the entire population has a structural defect like this one. But the dangers of this rare condition are extremely real. Dr. Saba told Maureen that her collapse in the park was more likely a heart attack, and if it had lasted much longer, she would have died. Maureen was speechless. Across 20-plus years of seeing doctors throughout the country, no one had ever mentioned even the existence of a condition like this. She'd been living with a misshapen heart since she was born, and without Dr. Saba, it's very possible she would have never found out and likely died from it. Later that summer, Maureen underwent a 3-hour-long open-heart surgery at the University of Washington Medical Center in Seattle, in which surgeons successfully moved her right coronary artery, the one that was in the wrong spot, over to its proper location. Maureen still has lingering chest tightness and fatigue, but the operation allowed her to go back to her physically active life without fear. Gradually, she was able to start fully exercising again, and though her speed is not what it once was, Maureen has never fainted since. At 12:20 a.m. on August 17, 2020, a police sergeant named Kevin Bingham was sitting inside of his cruiser in a parking lot in Scottsdale, Arizona with the windows rolled down when he heard a strange sound. He couldn't place exactly what it was. At first, it sort of sounded like a woman screaming, but then it kind of morphed into more of like a screech, like a cat would make in a fight. But at the same time, this sound was sort of echoey, almost like it was in a cave or something. But Sergeant Bingham is looking around him and, there's a school and a baseball field, there's houses and apartment buildings. I mean, he's in a typical American neighborhood. There's no caves anywhere near him. But regardless of where specifically this noise was originating from, what was clear to Sergeant Bingham is that whoever or whatever was making this noise sounded like they needed help, and so he decided he would go investigate. So Sergeant Bingham left the parking lot, turned right onto the road, and began driving roughly in the direction of the sound. But again, remember, the sound is kind of echoey, it's very hard to place where it's coming from. But as he continued driving down this road, Sergeant Bingham realized the noise was getting louder, and so he must be getting closer. And so just ahead of Sergeant Bingham at the end of this road is this huge health club. There's a big fitness center, and then behind it, kind of attached to it, was an outdoor pool area, and then surrounding the pool area was a 12-foot tall brick fence. And so Sergeant Bingham thought, based on the proximity to this noise, maybe the sound, the screeching sound, is coming from somewhere in this health club. And so Sergeant Bingham drives up to the health club, parks his cruiser, he gets out, turns on his flashlight, and right away he hears more screeching, and immediately Sergeant Bingham can tell it's coming from inside of the enclosed pool area, behind that 12-foot tall wall. And so Sergeant Bingham can't see into the pool area, but again, he can tell, whatever it is, it's in there. And also, at the same time he's kind of pinpointing the sound, he can tell that this noise, this screeching sound, really doesn't sound like an animal. It sounds like a person. And so Sergeant Bingham runs up to the brick wall, and he listens really intently to see if maybe, in addition to the screeching sound, if he can hear, splashing sounds or some other activity inside of the pool area that would kind of give away what's actually happening. Maybe somebody snuck in after hours and now they're struggling to swim in one of these pools. But as he strained to listen, all he heard over and over again was the screeching sound, but nothing else. There's no splashing, there's no other activity, it's just the screeching sound. And so as Sergeant Bingham was wondering how he was going to get into this pool area to see what was going on, he looked over and he saw there were 2 gym cleaners coming out of the fitness center. And so Sergeant Bingham ran over to them and he asked them, hey, are you the only 2 that are working in this health club right now? Or is there somebody out in the pool area? And the cleaners looked at Sergeant Bingham and just shook their head and said, no, we are the only ones working right now. And we've been listening to that screeching sound too. We don't know what it is. And then shortly after they said this to Sergeant Bingham, suddenly the noises, the screeching sounds, changed. And it went from just being these guttural, high-pitched screeches to somebody yelling out a single word: help. And so the second Sergeant Bingham heard this, he grabbed his radio and called for backup. About 2 minutes later, another officer showed up, and right away the cleaners opened up the doors to the fitness center, and Bingham and the other officer ran inside. They cut through the huge gym to the very back, where there were doors that led out to the pool area. And this pool area is huge. It's actually the biggest part of this health club. And so they open up the doors, they go outside, and both officers are expecting to, see this person that's calling out for help. But instead, once they get outside, it's eerily silent, and there's absolutely no activity anywhere. Right in front of them are these two pools. There's this huge lap pool, no one's in it, the water is calm. And then next to it is another pool, a smaller pool that has a water playground right in the middle of it, but that one as well is devoid of people and totally calm. And so the officers are looking at each other like, where is this person that clearly was calling for help a second ago? But just then, the cries for help began again, and this time they were able to kind of pinpoint where it was coming from. It was coming from a third pool, kind of in the back of the pool area. Beyond these two pools and beyond some cabanas, there was this third shallow pool with two water slides going into it. And from the sound of these screeches, it sounded very much like this person must be in or near these slides. And so at this point, Sergeant Bingham became a little bit skeptical that whoever this was really needed help. He felt like it was more likely that, somebody had just snuck in after hours who maybe was high on drugs or mentally ill, and now they're just kind of causing a scene inside one of the slides. Or maybe it's somebody who snuck in just to play a prank, to screw with the cops and act like they were in trouble when they really weren't. And so Sergeant Bingham looks at the other officer and they kind of are like, okay, let's go see what's going on here. And they make their way over to the slides. And when they get there, there's two slides. There's one slide, which is blue, and it's an open top. So if you were sliding down it, you'd be visible the entire time you're on the slide. And there's nobody on this slide. So whoever is making these sounds, they're not on or in the blue slide. But the other slide, the red slide, was a tube slide, and so if you were going down this slide, you'd be hidden inside the tube. And so both officers are thinking, okay, the person who's yelling out for help has got to be inside of this red slide. And so the two officers went to the base of the red slide, and they looked up inside of it, but they couldn't see anyone, but it was a big enough slide that it was possible they were, just beyond their line of sight. And so Sergeant Bingham just yelled in like, hey, are you okay? And the person did respond to this, but they didn't respond with words. They just responded with more screeching. And so Sergeant Bingham tells the other officer, hey, stay right here at the foot of the slide. I'm going to go up and go down the slide. We'll meet in the middle. We'll find this person and we'll get them out of here. And so the other officer stays put and Sergeant Bingham goes to the stairs. He makes his way up to the top of the platform that led to both slides. He went to the top of the red slide and he looked down into it, but he couldn't see anybody. But again, the slide was long enough, it's possible that from both sides, looking up and looking down, your line of sight would not allow you to see the person right in the middle. And so Sergeant Bingham yelled into the slide like, hey, I'm coming down and my partner's coming up. We're going to find you here. Like, if you're in there, go down, get out of the slide. But again, the response they got was not words. It was just more guttural screaming and moaning. And so, feeling kind of annoyed, Sergeant Bingham gets his flashlight and aims it straight ahead of him, and he begins slowly making his way down the slide, and at the same time, his partner at the bottom began making his way up the slide. So as they're doing it, both officers are yelling like, hey, if you're in here, we're coming in, like, let's go, you gotta get out of here. But again, all they're hearing is more screaming, and as the officers get closer and closer to the middle, they're expecting to see someone, but then suddenly both officers come face to face right in the middle of this red slide, and there's nobody there. It's just them. And so at this point, both officers are totally freaked out. This did not make sense. They've been listening to this person screaming out for the last few minutes, and it sounded so much like they were in this slide. Like, how could they not be? And so Sergeant Bingham and the other officer get out of the slide, and they start screaming out for this person, like, hey, tell us where you are. But in response, they just continue to get more and more desperate sounding screeches. And it sounded like the screeches really were in this red slide, or at least somewhere really close by, but there's no one anywhere near them. There's nowhere for this person to be. It didn't make any sense.
And so having no other ideas, Sergeant Bingham went over to the blue slide, the open top slide that very clearly nobody is on, but he hopped on it and thought, let me just check, and he began going up the slide. Now, this slide was not a straight slide. It actually went around in the middle like a corkscrew. And so as Sergeant Bingham began walking up the slide began to turn, and so he began walking along this corkscrew section of the slide on the way to the top. And about halfway up the corkscrew section, when he's basically halfway up the slide, Sergeant Bingham just stopped and just kind of scanned around because now he's at a higher position, a better vantage point across this outdoor area. And he's looking all around him, despite still hearing these screams coming out of what feels like right where he is. He doesn't see anybody, but then, right as he's about to continue going up the slide, something catches his eye just below him. And he stops, and he kind of leans over the edge of this blue slide and looks straight down, and he could not believe what he saw. It would turn out earlier that night, so right before 12:20 a.m., which is when Sergeant Bingham first heard that screeching sound, a 32-year-old man named Ryan Kelly, who was naked and high on meth, snuck into the pool area. He climbed over that wall, jumped inside, and eventually he found his way over to the stairs that led up to the platform that allowed you to go down the red and blue slides. And once he got up there, instead of, sliding down the slide, he began walking down that blue slide, the open top slide that has a corkscrew section in the middle. He began walking down it, and when he got about halfway down it, around the part where it began to corkscrew, he stopped and at some point must have looked around him and noticed there was a support beam basically running from the ground straight up, basically as high as the blue slide was, where there were all these arms branching off of it that supported the corkscrew section of the slide. It was just holding the corkscrew up. And from where Ryan was standing, he would have had the ability to see the top of this beam. And he would have seen that the top of this beam was open. It was a round beam with about an 18-inch diameter across, and to any sane person, it would be very apparent that you're not supposed to go inside of this support beam, but Ryan, being high on meth, decided he would go inside of this support beam. He climbed up to the top of it and then wedged his feet into this narrow opening, and Ryan's a pretty skinny guy, he's naked, he's slick with sweat, and he began lowering himself into this pipe, this hollow pipe that goes all the way to the ground. And after he got his feet in there and his legs in there, he's forcing himself down, he finally got most of his torso in, and then he would have realized his hands would not be able to fit unless he put them over his head. And so he put his arms over his head and just continued to wiggle himself down into this pipe. And at some point, probably around the time that his shoulders cleared the pipe, he kind of slipped pretty quickly about halfway down the pipe. Not to the ground, basically suspended right in the middle of this tiny, tight pipe. Now, we don't know for sure if Ryan intended to get out of this pipe at some point, but once he was about halfway down the pipe with his arms up over his head, there was absolutely no way he could get himself out again. There was just nowhere to pull or anything. He's completely wedged, barely able to breathe, and on top of that, he's in Arizona. It's one of the hottest places in the world, and on top of that, they were experiencing a heat wave, and his body, his naked body, is pressed all against the inside of this metal pipe that conducts heat. And so he's basically in this really tight space, cooking alive, and there's no way to get out. And so at some point, as Ryan is likely realizing that he is completely screwed here, and he's beginning to literally cook to death, he began trying to scream out for help, but he was likely in so much pain, and also again under the influence of meth, that he couldn't quite yell out words. He just let out those horrible screeching sounds, and those were the noises that Sergeant Bingham heard. But then when Sergeant Bingham and his partner got into the pool area, they were able to identify roughly where Ryan was stuck, but Ryan, again, couldn't make words. He's so messed up, he's in so much pain that he just continued to scream, and because he was in that pipe, it kind of created this weird echoey phenomenon where when he would scream out, his voice would come out of the pipe and almost kind of get thrown around the park. That's why Sergeant Bingham and the other officer couldn't quite figure out where he was, and at one point it sounded like he was in that red slide, when obviously he wasn't. And so finally, at some point, Sergeant Bingham walked up the blue slide, he's halfway up, he's hearing Ryan screaming, and he turns and he looks down, and from his perspective where he was standing, he was looking down into that pipe. And looking up at him inside of this pipe is Ryan, arms up over his head, wide-eyed, screeching, trying to be saved. But unfortunately for Ryan, his rescue was a very technically difficult thing to pull off. He was too far down the pipe for anyone to reach him to pull him up, and when they threw a rope down to him inside of the pipe, Ryan was too weak to grab onto the rope. And so for hours and hours, rescue crews tried to get Ryan out. The whole time Ryan is panicking and screaming and cooking to death, basically. They couldn't get him out, and so finally at the 7-hour mark after he was found, they had to bring in a crane, and they had to fully dismantle the slide and pull that pipe out of the ground. But unfortunately, by that point, it was too late for Ryan. He had passed away. An autopsy would show that ultimately what killed Ryan was the combination of the meth in his bloodstream and the extreme heat he was exposed to inside of that pipe.
Our next story is called Horsehead. Jacob Cockle always loved the water. He grew up in a town called Penzance in the UK, and he spent virtually all of his time surfing at one of their beaches. By the time he was 10 years old, he started skipping school to go surfing and started getting in a lot of trouble for that. But despite his parents' and his teachers' frustrations with him, there was always one person that had his back and totally understood him, and that was his older sister, Grace. They were so close, they developed their own special language they talked to each other in, and Jacob used it so much that people actually thought he had a speech problem. But when Jacob was 17, his life was turned upside down when Grace was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and she died very quickly after that. This had a profound impact on Jacob. It was like his entire view of the world had totally changed overnight, and he began to believe that Grace's energy had been transferred to him and that it was now his duty to live for the two of them. And so what this translated to is Jacob began taking lots and lots of risks because he felt like he didn't want to pass up opportunities. He wanted to live life to the fullest, even if it was a little bit reckless. In addition to loving the water, Jacob also loved photography. And so with this new risk-taking attitude, he began doing these water-based stunts and filming himself in the process. Things like surfing in storms, or leaping off of buildings into fairly shallow water, or diving to dangerous depths on a breath hold. And Jacob loved it. He loved taking these risks. He loved filming himself taking these risks. And so he decided this was going to be his career. He was going to be a world-famous photographer that specialized in dangerous photos and films. And so Jacob got this big piece of paper and he put it on his bedroom wall, and with black marker he wrote himself a reminder, I will become a world-famous photographer and I will let nothing stand in my way. Basically, he was prepared to go to any length to get the shots that he needed to get. And this intense attitude worked. By his early 20s, he had won major awards with National Geographic and the Sunday Times. He was also a regular contributor to surf magazines where he almost always got the cover shot. Most of his award-winning pictures were taken of the sea in its most violent and turbulent forms. The money Jacob earned from these competitions he spent on improving his photography equipment. If he was ever given a physical prize like a brand new TV, he would just give it away to his friends. Because all Jacob was really focused on was going out and living life to the fullest and taking crazy chances and capturing those experiences on film. And one crazy experience that he had always wanted to capture on film actually took place right in his hometown of Penzance. A very strong whirlpool would appear a few times a year in a harbor that was right near his childhood home. It was just a quirk of engineering designed to keep the harbor from silting up. At high tide, the water would come in and it would hit this quay wall, and at the bottom of the quay wall was a tunnel that fed into this other pool. And so that would fill up with water. And then when the tide retreated during low tide, the water in the harbor would drain out and the water from the pool would slowly filter out back through this tunnel, pushing the silt and sand out of the harbor. But sometimes when the water came into the harbor during high tide, it would come in so quickly it would build up against the quay wall and it wouldn't drain fast enough down through that tunnel into the pool.
And so just like in your bathtub, if you pull the plug when it's full, you'll see a whirlpool form as the water is sucked down the drain. The same thing would happen at this quay wall as all this water is being forced down and sucked through this pipe. It would create this huge whirlpool that you could see on the surface from the quay wall. And even though this whirlpool only formed a couple of times a year, it was so dangerous, there were caution signs all around the edge of the harbor and on the quay wall telling people to stay out of the water. But in his mid-20s, Jacob ignored those signs and he started jumping into this whirlpool every time it formed. And he was able to kind of swirl around the outside and he would film it inside and just on top. And he would upload his videos to YouTube and they would get millions and millions of views. They were totally beautiful and terrifying at the same time. On May 28, 2013, when Jacob was 28 years old, he noticed that the whirlpool was back in his hometown and he wanted to go out and film inside of it again. And so he ran to his friend David's house and he asked him to, hey, come down to the harbor and film me inside of this whirlpool. And so by the time David got his stuff together and made it to the quay wall, he looked down and he saw Jacob was already in the whirlpool swirling around. David also noticed that Jacob was wearing a rubber horsehead mask, and he told David the reason he was doing it is because it would be more eye-catching on YouTube. So David leaned over the wall and began filming Jacob as he swirled around this whirlpool in his horse mask making neighing sounds, and at some point Jacob stopped and he swam away from the whirlpool, but you could see the pull of the whirlpool was very strong because even with flippers on, Jacob really struggled to swim away from this whirlpool. But he was in good spirits about it and he was laughing with David and saying how when he first jumped in, he was actually pretty scared of this whirlpool. It's definitely the strongest one he had been in over at this quay wall. And David would say, yeah, I can tell from up here, that one's really strong. For the next 10 or 15 minutes, David and Jacob kind of joked back and forth about the strength of the whirlpool, and Jacob would put his mask back down and swirl around inside of the whirlpool, then get out again. And then towards the end of the video, Jacob yells up to David that he only has one more thing in mind that he wants to do with the whirlpool. He wants to dive down below and film it from underneath. And so he asks David to hand down his camera. David hands it down, and you see Jacob adjusting his camera, and then he dives below the surface to begin filming this whirlpool. And so David's up on the top watching Jacob, and he's very familiar with Jacob. He knows he does things like this. He knows he has a great breath hold. But after a couple of minutes, when he doesn't reemerge, David gets scared and starts yelling for him. And when he still doesn't come up, David turns and runs to the other side of the quay wall and looks over that railing towards the pool side. And he can see the water is still rushing into the pool, and there's no sign of Jacob. And so he ran back and forth a couple of times, and he didn't see Jacob until finally he went back to the pool side, and he saw Jacob down below. He was lying face down in the water. So David ran down and waded out to him, but it was already too late. Jacob had drowned. The reason Jacob was able to swirl around at the top of this whirlpool and not get pulled under is because he had a wetsuit on, and wetsuits are buoyant. But as you go underneath the water, the deeper you go, the water pressure pushes against your wetsuit and it reduces the overall buoyancy of your wetsuit. And so when Jacob dove down into this whirlpool, the pressure pushed against his suit, he lost his buoyancy, and then he got caught up in the current of this very strong whirlpool, and he was pulled slowly down to the bottom. And so he probably fought as much as he could to try to get out of there, but he couldn't, and eventually was forced into that tunnel underneath the quay wall, and he was under there until he drowned, and then he was eventually spit out the other side.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Fixer-Upper.
On May 28, 1986, a Florida real estate agent named Marguerite Welty walked up to the front door of this little white stucco home sitting right on the edge of Lake Placid in Florida. Marguerite pulled out a key from her pocket, she unlocked the door, opened it up, and then she turned around, and standing right in front of her were her clients, this young couple named Lois and Richard Goodman, who were thinking about buying a vacation home. And so this was one of the homes they were checking out. And so Marguerite smiled at her clients and gestured for them to come inside. The house sat at the end of a quiet, shady street lined with huge trees and other small vacation homes, and a lot of these vacation homes were perfectly manicured and beautiful, but the house they were touring today was not. It was unmaintained and overgrown, the paint was chipped and fading. It just looked bad.
because the owner of this property at one time had used this house as their vacation home, but lately they had just kind of stopped coming out here, and so they really never came out to check on the property, and so it definitely had the look of an abandoned property. And now the owner didn't even know if they could fix it anymore, and so they decided they would just sell it and let somebody else deal with it. And so Marguerite led Richard and Lois into the house, and she brought them right into the carpeted living room, and the house was very musky and dark. All the windows were shut and all the blinds were drawn. And so Marguerite kind of instinctively walked over to the windows and began opening up the curtains and opening up the blinds, letting sunlight into the house. And so as this room is suddenly being lit up by the sunlight, behind her, Marguerite hears Lois and Richard start to laugh at something. And so Marguerite turned around to see what was so funny, and when she saw what Lois and Richard were laughing at, Marguerite did not think it was very funny. In fact, she thought the fact that they were laughing right now was kind of rude, especially when you considered what this couple had asked of Marguerite. They had come to Marguerite and said, hey, we want to buy a vacation home. It needs to be perfect. It needs to be on the water. It needs to have this and this and this. But we have a tiny budget. Go find us homes. And so Marguerite had really struggled to find vacation homes that were in their budget, but then she had found this diamond in the rough, this house on the coast of Lake Placid. It had 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. It had a garage, direct access to the water. It even had a boat dock. I mean, this house was perfect. Now, of course, this house had obvious downsides, like the fact that it was clearly a fixer-upper. I mean, anybody who bought this home would have to put a lot of work into just making it livable again. And then also, there was a distinct weird vibe about the property itself. Because the owner was never there, they had covered all the furniture inside of this home with white sheets, which kind of gave it a sort of haunted house vibe. And then also, there was virtually nothing of value inside of this home, because again, the owner was like never here. But for some reason, there was this super intense security system on the house. I mean, there was cameras everywhere, and the windows had metal bars over them. And so the aesthetic inside and outside this house was not a good one. But again, Marguerite felt like if they could just look past the negative stuff, this was really the perfect place for them. But now, here Marguerite's clients were, laughing away at the kind of goofy interior of this home. It's like they were being totally disrespectful both to Marguerite and frankly to the owner of this property. I mean, this is a good opportunity. What are you doing? But ultimately, Marguerite couldn't force her clients to be appreciative of this, and so she just kind of laughed along with them, but then very quickly changed the subject and told them, hey, let's go walk around the rest of the house, make sure you see the whole place before you pass judgment. But Marguerite only had to lead Richard and Lois around the house for a couple more minutes to figure out they definitely were not in the market for this house. They could not look past the bizarre kind of spooky almost atmosphere inside the house and how run down it was. So they were just not going to put an offer on this house, and Marguerite knew it. And so even though Marguerite was definitely frustrated, she told her clients, don't worry about it. I'll go back to the drawing board. I'll find more properties and we'll check those out. And so Marguerite led Richard and Lois out of the property. She shut and locked the door behind her, and then she and her clients left. Two days later, on May 30th, 1986, the owner of this rundown old vacation home came by to check on the property. Basically, because they were trying to sell it, they just wanted to go up and make sure there were no obviously bad things about the property. They knew it was in rough shape, but, they're just doing a sanity check. And so they get to this property, they open up the door, and they step inside, and right away, the owner is hit with this horrible smell. Now, the owner knew it normally did not smell great inside this home, but this smell he was smelling now was just so bad. It was so pungent, he knew it was not normal. And so the owner began walking around the house trying to figure out where the smell was coming from, and at some point he found himself in the living room, and his eyes happened to land on the thing that Richard and Lois Goodman had been laughing at 2 days earlier. Except when the owner saw this thing, he didn't think it was funny at all. In fact, what he did is he instantly turned around, ran out of the house, grabbed a phone, and called 911. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 1 1. 4 days earlier, on May 26th, a 28-year-old man named Thomas Lopez Ruiz, who was living in this makeshift campsite down by the water near Lake Placid, he decided to leave his campsite and go into town to try to earn some money. Thomas did not have a steady job. Instead, he did odd jobs in town whenever he could to earn a few bucks. But on this day, when Thomas went into town, there was no work. So Thomas decided he would go rob one of the many vacation homes along the coastline of Lake Placid. And the home that he picked is the same vacation home that Marguerite would take the Goodmans to 2 days later. And so Thomas arrives in front of this overgrown property and he tries the doors and they're all locked. However, Thomas had a plan. Thomas was a pretty small guy. He was about 5'2" tall, only weighed about 140 pounds. And so he figured he could just slip through the chimney. That's how he could break into the house. And at first it went great. He slipped in no problem. And before long, he was making his way down towards the inside of the house. But what Thomas realized as he went down the chimney is the chimney was not perfectly straight up and down. Instead, it was sort of tapered, where at the top it was wide, but the deeper you got, so the farther down you went in the chimney, the narrower the inside of the chimney got.
Through days ahead, I see hope and love will set me free. From the darkness I will flee. Brighter days ahead for me.
And so when Thomas was almost all the way down the chimney, he got stuck. He could not get the rest of the way down, but where he got stuck, he couldn't grab the top of the chimney. He couldn't pull himself out. And so he is absolutely wedged, can't go down, can't go up, and making matters even worse was every time he exhaled, his chest would shrink a little bit, and that would cause him to slip a little bit farther, a little bit deeper into the chimney, and then when he would try to breathe in again, his chest would not be able to fully expand again. And so basically, every second that went by, Thomas was sinking lower and lower and lower by little bits, making it harder and harder and harder to breathe. And you gotta figure that he was screaming for help, which again was causing him to breathe a bunch, causing him to sink even farther. And so it would have made breathing extremely difficult. And so Thomas is like in this absolute claustrophobic nightmare, and without outside help, he had no chance of survival. Two days later, Marguerite Welty brought the Goodmans into that property, and she would open up the blinds, and sunlight would come into the living room, and Marguerite would hear Lois and Richard laughing at something, and she would turn around, and she would see they were pointing at the fireplace, and visible in this fireplace were two legs dangling down inside the chimney. They were not so far down that they were touching the ground, they were just kind of suspended in the air. And Lois and Richard, based on the way the house looked already, the kind of spooky vibe, there's white sheets over all the furniture. There are these bars on all the windows. Everything is dark and dirty and kind of gross. Like there's this haunted house vibe to this place. And they're thinking this must be a Halloween decoration or some sort of prank. A mannequin kind of jammed up into the chimney, maybe to look like a robber breaking into your house or something that the owner never took down, because clearly the owner stopped taking care of this property. And so it kind of makes sense that these decorations would be left out. And so Lois and Richard are laughing at this Halloween decoration, and Marguerite, she looks at the legs too and also thinks they're just some Halloween decoration, doesn't think anything of it. And so finally, they end up leaving, and that was it. But, as I'm sure you all have guessed, of course those legs were not mannequin legs. Those were Thomas's legs. And in fact, the creepiest part about this is Thomas may have been alive during the house tour. The autopsy showed he actually did not die of asphyxiation, so he didn't suffocate. He died from dehydration, which takes about 2 days, and this house tour was about 2 days in. And the day prior to the house tour, a neighbor had been outside and they thought they heard someone yelling inside of the property, but for some reason, the neighbor just didn't do anything about it. And so there's a pretty good chance Thomas was barely alive as they were touring the house. But, by the time the owner came back 2 days later and smelled that horrible smell, Thomas had passed away, and that smell was the smell of his body decomposing. Also, just to close the loop on this, it's not clear why the homeowner had that really aggressive security system with the bars on the windows. He just did.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events. But we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you